All right. Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Katie Akins with Arizona Farm Bureau.
I'm Chelsea McGuire, also with Arizona Farm Bureau. And today, Katie, we get to do a quick update on all things water because we don't talk about water enough.
No, never enough.
No. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what's going on at the legislature because there's always something. We're going to look at regulatory agency action as well. So that stuff that might not be our lawmakers, but it's our agencies and the folks that govern what's going on. And then sort of what we're facing coming down the pipeline and what we think is going to happen in the next 12 months or so.
Well, it's always good to dive into water issues. Did you catch that pun there?
I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. Okay.
I
And
did.
of course, I love the alliterations. Anyone who knows me. So wonderful job with the W's there.
Thank you. I really had this vision. My 2-year-old is really into a book right now about a pig who lives in a palace. And so everything on every page is like all P words. And so I was really going for that kind of vibe. Then I realized I just don't know that many W words. So we're just going to have an alliterative title and go from there.
I like it. I do.
Yeah.
But let's get back to the real business of today, the one water word or the one W word, water. So can you remind us what it is that we already know about water, or at least what you and I have already discussed about water this year?
Sure thing. So those of you who have been with us, not just all of this year, but really from the beginning of our ag issues presentations will know that water is a pretty frequent topic. Even if it's not the main topic of our presentation, we definitely touch on it and things that our farmers and ranchers are doing to conserve that resource. And honestly, before you dig into this month's webinar, if you haven't already watched our presentation from September of 2019, the many types of water, I would highly recommend you go back, watch that one first, because that's going to set up some of the context, some of the overarching information that'll help you understand why what we're talking about today matters and give you a little bit more of a frame of reference for what we're talking about today as well.
I like it. And as Chelsea mentioned, all of our past recordings for the webinars are located at www.azfb.org. Click on that really cool, here it is, tractor and books logo, and then hit the ag issues button on the left-hand side, and it will jump you to every single webinar we've done since last year. So I think there's 11 different ones on there right now. So they can gain access to all of these past ones, especially the ones on water that you're referencing today.
Definitely. So with that, let's jump right into either what's happening or what has already happened when it comes to water in this year's legislative session.
So overall, has the session been good, bad when it comes to Farm Bureau's policies?
Surprisingly good. And I say surprisingly because it's not really what we anticipated. The election went a little bit differently than we thought it was going to. There's a lot of distraction out there right now. So water isn't necessarily one of those things you see in the headlines when it comes to the legislative session, but it has actually gone extremely well. And I think that part of that is that when COVID derailed everything in the last session, we had a couple of good bills lined up when it came to water. So a lot of the groundwork had already been done for those. We'd laid that foundation for some bills to pass extremely quickly out of the legislature because there was already some broad support for them. And we'd already sort of educated people on what the bills did. So we just had to say, hey, remember when we already did this and you already voted for this? And people said, oh yeah, I do remember that. So that was really helpful. And this is the exact story or the exact kind of framework for the first bill we'll talk about, which was a bill out of the House, number 2056. And that bill was called the Conservation Non-Forfeiture Bill.
I'm hoping you're going to break that down for us just a little bit.
Yes. And surprisingly, this is actually not the most complicated bill we're going to cover today. It sounds complicated, but it's not. If you go back to our original September 2019 webinar, you'll remember that Arizona's surface water, so lakes, rivers, and streams, that's governed by a concept of use it or lose it. So if you have a right to that surface water to use it, and you don't use that right, you actually forfeit the ability to use that water. So if you have a 4-acre-foot right, and for 5 years you don't use it, Arizona would rather see that water go to good use than just flow down the river. So you actually lose the right to use that water, and it goes to the next person in line. Now it makes sense, and we understand wanting to put water to use and not just having it kind of sit there or do something that's not productive. But the problem is we've become so much more efficient in the way we use water. So now somebody with that 4-acre-foot allotment might be implementing conservation practices or crop rotations that mean they only use 3.5 or even 3 acre-feet of that water. And what the fear was is that non-use of that partial aspect of that right would mean that they forfeit that right. And so then if they want to irrigate more acreage later on or plant a slightly more water intensive crop, because that's what the market is requiring that they do, they wouldn't have the ability to do that. It also meant that if they were afraid as a producer of losing that water, their incentive wasn't to save it. Their incentive was, I'm going to use it in case somebody takes it away from me because I didn't use it. And that didn't make a whole lot of sense, right? We didn't like the idea of incentivizing people to use more water than maybe they needed to use. And so we said, let's get together with groups who also have that same concern and who want to see water conserved. And let's change our law to say that this forfeiture idea, this use it or lose it, doesn't apply to water that you're intentionally conserving under a system or a process of conservation. So that's what this bill did. It took away that non-use aspect and that forfeiture aspect, and it really was supported by a broad coalition, people from both sides of the aisle, environmental groups, agricultural groups, industry groups. Everyone liked this bill. And because everybody liked it, we were able to get it through in lightning speed. It took less than a month from the opening of the session for the bill to pass. And then Governor Ducey signed it on February 18th. So it is signed, sealed, delivered, will be the law of the land probably sometime in August.
Well, that's awesome that it went through so fast and that it's done, because as scary as it sounded when you said the title of all of this thing, it really just seems like it's a common sense piece, right? You want to encourage people to introduce these practices that allow them to conserve water, right? Using the technology and all these things. But agriculturalists were almost being penalized, or they had this fear and almost had to, I don't know what I'm going to do. If I do this, I'm going to lose this. So what's my incentive to make these investments and do it? And that really puts them in between a rock and a hard place. So I'm really happy to see that that went through, and a huge benefit to our producers.
Yeah, we were very excited about it. And just like you said, because it was common sense, that's why we were able to rally so much support around it. And so it's great for me to be able to go on Twitter and see that the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy are super excited about the same bill that I'm super excited about.
That doesn't happen very often.
No, more and more often all the time, but not very often. So it's nice to have friends that we, get to actually work with and do a lot with on these kinds of issues.
Very cool. All right, what was up next?
So next is kind of a similar idea in terms of we want water to be used as effectively as possible. It's also another bill that was left over from last year. And what it does is allows substitution of a water right on one piece of land for a water right on another piece of land.
That sounds like it could be complicated.
Yeah, it honestly really is. And so it's probably best if we give kind of an example to go through it. All right. So let's say you're a farmer and you farm 2 parcels of land. They're joining, which means they're right next to each other. But one parcel has water right A and the other parcel has water right B. So they're right next to each other. You're kind of doing the same thing on them, but they're different water rights.
So, okay, so I get what you're saying, that they're next to each other, but the water comes from different decrees or agreements. How does that work?
Exactly. So it's a different legal right. So maybe the first water right came in 1932, and then the second one didn't come until like 1945, right? So they're the same source of water, but just the legalities of it and where they fall in line, the rights are from different pieces of paper, essentially. Look at it that way. Okay. Now, let's say that on Section A, a while ago, a couple decades ago, there was a super flood. I think there was one in like 1993, right? And so the flood damaged a bunch of your acres, washed away the topsoil, exposed some rock. And because of that, things just don't grow well there anymore. So you really haven't planted there since that flood damage. Because you haven't planted there, you're not using all of the water you have a right to use, because it doesn't really make sense to irrigate something that's not going to grow a good crop.
Wasting, right?
Exactly. Okay. But now, let's say you've got the water you can use on parcel A. You want to use it somewhere else.
I mean, that makes sense.
Right? It does. Like, say you wanted to use it on parcel B.
Parcel B, yeah.
Right next to it. Okay. Well, before this bill, you could do that. Okay. But you had to go through this process called a sever and a transfer. It's really expensive, takes a whole lot of work with administrative agencies. Sometimes it opens you up to even a legal challenge to what it is that you're trying to do, because it's a public process, which means the public gets to sort of comment on that process and decide whether they like it or they don't like it. Honestly, it's kind of a nightmare.
Yeah, it seems like maybe it's not worth the hassle to move the water.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what this bill was trying to change. Because what this bill says is that if you want to substitute water from parcels that fit this description, right? Parcel A to parcel B, they're right next to each other, they're adjoining, they use the same water source. You can do that as a matter of right. You don't have to go through the sever and transfer process. You just apply to the department, you notify them, hey, I'm going to do this. And then you can start using that water on parcel B so that you're making the most of every single drop of water you have access to.
So it seems to me that this specific bill actually has a lot to do with conservation too. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It goes back to a couple of things. Just like the bill before, right? We want water to be used on the most effective land. And we don't want people to use water ineffectively just because they're afraid they're going to lose the right to that water. And so we want to make sure farmers are using all of the tools that they need to use water well. And so what we're hoping is that this bill is going to lift a burden. It's a very specific example, right? It's not going to apply to every single farmer who's using surface water, but we're hoping it lifts that burden of having to go through the sever and transfer process when it doesn't make sense to go through the sever and transfer process. And that means there's actually more incentive for farmers to look at the way they're managing their land and say, okay, how can I manage this to the very best of my ability?
Okay, so I have a question for you. So we're talking about parcel A and B, right? Yeah. And they were adjoining properties or parcels. What if I want to move water from A to D and they are not adjoining parcels?
Yeah.
Does that still apply?
So this bill doesn't apply, but that sever and transfer process that we talked about, that does still apply. So you can still go through that, but for a move like that, it makes a little more sense for us to have some sort of overarching approval, because you're moving water from being used in one specific area to being used somewhere entirely different. And so that might have environmental impacts, that might have impacts on the other people who use that particular water source, right? So we want to have a little more input on a big resource management decision like that. But we also want farmers to be able to make easy decisions, quick decisions, without worrying about that kind of long and costly administrative nightmare. So to move it from one parcel to a completely different set of land, we still need that accountability structure. But to move it to something right next door, that makes a lot more sense to let the resource managers make that decision instead of some bureaucrats and administrators.
That totally makes sense. I like that.
Always. All right.
All right, we got another one, don't we?
We got one last water bill. It's not the only bill that went through on water, but it's the last one we'll talk about today. And it's a really big one. And it establishes a surface waters protection program administered by the state of Arizona. Now, if you are even vaguely familiar with how surface water is regulated, you're probably more familiar with how the federal government does that, right? And in 2015, there was a rule that was implemented by the presidential administration then that we spent a lot of time fighting against.
We didn't like that one, did we?
No. We didn't like it at all. And there's a couple of reasons why. And it's a little bit less, what the rule let us do and didn't let us do. It's more whether we had to follow the rule at all and how difficult it was for us to determine whether we had to follow that rule. So this Waters of the United States rule, when you hear us talking about WOTUS, what we're referring to is a rule that stated what you can discharge into certain waters, what a discharge is, and what waters are covered by that discharge. Okay, so those are kind of the three things that we're looking at. And this rule, frankly, was a nightmare. It's one, the worst part about it probably is how unclear it was as to what actual waters were covered by this rule. Now, the act that this rule is supposed to implement talks a lot about navigable waters. So you would think, hey, navigable, that would mean like a real big river you can actually put a boat in, right? But unfortunately, the way this rule was written, we're talking dry stream beds, washes that only have water in them right after it rains, and then 24 hours, they're gone. There were all sorts of things that are clearly not navigable, even if they have water in them, that sometimes don't even have water in them. And then suddenly this rule was saying, oh, no, we're going to tell you what you can and cannot discharge into that particular water. And then when we're talking about discharges, it could be something as simple as doing ground maintenance to plant a crop, right? Because you're moving dirt from one place to another, might get into this quote unquote waterway. And now this rule is saying that you either can't do it or you have to apply for a permit to do it, pay for that permit. So that was a nightmare. But then at the end of the day, you didn't even know if your water was covered by that. And so maybe you had to hire a team of engineers to come out and tell you whether your water was covered. And sometimes even they didn't know. Just all of this was one of those things that really looked a lot less like trying to protect our waters and a lot more like trying to prevent use of land that people had a right to use in the way that they wanted to use.
And I remember we talked about that specific example actually when we did our EPA or our ESA, the Endangered Species Act webinar. We talked about that and sort of that definition of navigable water and the restraints that it was putting on some of our folks. So do we like the bill that's going to replace this then?
We do. Oh. And yeah, that was kind of the response from a lot of our members, right? And so what happened is, and the reason that this bill is even a possibility is that in 2020, the Trump administration repealed the 2015 rule that we didn't like. So they said, okay, we're taking that rule off the books. We're replacing it with something different. And we're going to call it the Clean Water Rule. And the Clean Water Rule was a lot more clear, a lot more restrained, followed most of the principles that as Farm Bureau, we had really been advocating for when we were explaining why we didn't like the 2015 rule. So the 2020 rule is currently the law of the land. There's a lot of complicated legal action going on about that rule, but at the end of the day, 2020 rule is what's in place right now. And when that happened, when the WOTUS rule was repealed, replaced, some state regulators in most states, but Arizona included, kind of went, whoa, wait a minute. Now we feel like we don't have enough protection in the state. We feel like there's a lot of holes that were left because this rule has been repealed and replaced and we don't know what to do and we're trying to protect our waters. And for a little bit, it was sort of the sky is falling situation. And so we kind of had to step in and we kind of had to say, the sky is not falling. Here are all of the waters that are still protected, but then also recognized that if our state was having this reaction, probably any new presidential administration would have a very similar reaction and then would try to take away the 2020 rule and replace it with something too. And so there's all these sort of political forces where we like the rule that's in place, but decision makers and agencies don't necessarily like the rule that's in place. So what can we do to protect the good things that we got out of 2020 while also making sure that we are really protecting our waters and that we're making a straight-faced argument that this is good, this is enough protection, we're taking care of this crucial resource. So that's kind of what this bill is aimed to do. And it's the result of a lot of stakeholder input, especially from folks like President Smallhouse of the Arizona Farm Bureau, other agricultural interests and organizations, our mining industry, lots of folks who use water really well and who rely on water use to say, here's the best way to keep our water safe. And so some of the reasons we support it, I'm not going to get into everything that it does because frankly, it's kind of boring.
Wah, wah, wah.
But here's why we like what it does. The first is that it's extremely clear. Okay, this state bill is very, very black and white. The opposite of the WOTUS rule, right, where you have to hire a team of engineers to decide, do I even need a permit under the rule? It creates a literal map of water that's regulated and water that isn't regulated. So once it's through and once the agency has done all the agency stuff they have to do, we will have a map, and rivers in green are regulated, rivers in red aren't, right? And that means that our guys don't have to hire that team of engineers. They don't have to pay all of these fees to determine, hey, do I need to get a permit? They'll be able to look at that map and go, here's my farm, here's the river, not on my farm, I'm good to go.
You know, I think the counties need to adopt that in some of their homeowner permits as well. I'm currently trying to permit for a pool, and we're in this months long nightmare. And they're saying basically we have to hire engineers to submit all of these calcs for something that has nothing to do with the pool. So I can imagine if this is something that our folks are dealing with constantly, this would be a huge headache, because I've been dealing with it just for 2 months to try and do a pool, and I'm ready to get some people.
I do not envy you.
So I'm liking how this is sounding. Like you said, it's going to be very clear. The waters aren't muddied. Here's the map. This is, I know I'm all over it today, right? So I really, really like the idea of a map. I need a map for the permits that I'm going through. So that definitely makes sense. But is there anything else within this that we really like?
There is, and this is sort of like the legal nerd in me that really likes this aspect of it, right? Because what this rule does, or what this bill does, is it sets up our argument to the federal government. Because our argument is, states like Arizona are capable of protecting our own water. We can do this, guys. We've got it. We understand our ecology. We understand our hydrology way better than y'all. We're going to do this. That was one of our major arguments against the 2015 rule as well, right? Waters that aren't interstate, they're not crossing state lines. Why would the feds have jurisdiction anyway? We are going to be better at protecting these waters than you are. So now Arizona is really asserting its authority to do that. We're saying we can protect this water, and we not only are saying that, we're proving that we can do it, because here's the rule, here's the system that we have in place. So if, as I fully anticipate will happen, the Biden administration comes in and says, hey, we're repealing and replacing the 2020 rule, we have a straight-faced argument to step into that in a legal sense and go to a court and say, hey, court system, you need to stop that from happening because we are already taking care of this. So instead of us getting sort of a repeat of the terrible 2015 rule, we can say, we got this covered. We're already doing a good thing. You as the court system should step in and stop the executive administration from implementing the rule that they want to implement. Sounds complicated, but it basically puts us in a stronger position to stop the feds from doing something later.
And that makes complete sense for Arizona to sort of take control of Arizona's water, right? I did some traveling recently, and I was in Missouri, and totally different world there. It took me 20 hours to drive there, but totally different, right? I mean, it rained 2 inches one day while I was there. Things are very different there. And so that makes sense that finally we're sort of standing up here and saying, we know what to do. And there are these things in place that sort of showcase that, in fact, we can have success here doing it locally. What are the odds that the Biden administration is going to come back with what you've suggested there, repealing the 2020?
I honestly don't see a situation in which they don't. I think that the timing is going to depend on some of the other priorities of the administration. There's a lot of other things for it to be distracted by right now, like climate change, although this will probably play into the climate change discussions. The border crisis is another thing that they get to be distracted by right now. They just obviously still have, COVID things to figure out, just dropped a massive infrastructure package. So I don't see this happening in the next 90 days, but I don't think there's any way that we don't see at least a framework for what the Biden administration will do before the midterm elections in 2022.
Okay. Well, back to this bill 2691. Does the legislature like this?
It's a tough sell. It's been a tough sell since the beginning. For those who are kind of more aligned with our environmental friends, a little bit more on the left side of the political spectrum, it doesn't go far enough. For those who are more sort of on our zero government interference, more like the hard right of the spectrum, goes a little too far. So what we're doing is really working hard on selling the positives, the things we just spent, the last 5 minutes talking about of this kind of regulation, to make sure that it has enough support for it to get to the governor's desk. The good news is that the governor is wholeheartedly in support of this bill. His administration worked really closely with our environmental quality organization or quality administration to get this sort of written and get this through. So once it gets to his desk, we're safe, but we've got to get it there in the first place. And one of my favorite things to tell legislators, and something that is 100% true, because I wouldn't tell a legislator this if it wasn't, but ADEQ, the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, did a fantastic job working with stakeholders to get this bill to where it is. As I said, at the beginning, the narrative was very much sort of, oh my gosh, the sky is falling and everything's unprotected and it's all going to go up in flames. And we were very much able as stakeholders to come in and say, it's not, and here's why. And the agency listened, and they listened very well. They continued to have that conversation and got industry on board and comfortable with this bill. So we're really grateful for that, because that's not always the story when it comes to just a massive kind of regulatory overhaul like this is. And that's another reason we've been able to be on board with it. So we are encouraging all of our legislators to vote yes. We think it's the right thing to do for Arizona, and we'll just wait and see at this point.
Well, I know you guys are doing a great job with it, and I appreciate you sort of breaking down these 3 bills that are happening now. Is your team here at Farm Bureau, the government relations team, working or tracking anything else, especially here at the state level when it comes to water?
Yeah, we are. And most of that additional tracking is sort of happening at that regulatory agency level. So talking about ADEQ is a good segue into this, really. And the agency we'll talk about more now is our Department of, our water department. So the Arizona Department of Water Resources, because they are actually huge into and hugely involved in the management of groundwater here in Arizona. And the biggest thing that we've been following and engaging on has to do with updating the management plans for active management areas, or AMAs.
What are those?
Well, again, if you want to hear a hugely detailed description, go all the way back to that September webinar. But the short story is that AMAs are portions of the state where there are rules on who can use groundwater, how much of it they can use, and what they can use it for. These rules were put into place by the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, which is largely heralded as one of the most innovative ways of managing groundwater in a state across the nation. So we're kind of famous for that.
Go Arizona.
Right? We're good that way. And this map on this slide shows you where these active management areas are located. And if you take a quick look and know anything about Arizona geography, you will notice that the AMAs are located where most of the people in Arizona are located. And so we are really trying to manage and restrict the use of groundwater as a non-renewable resource in places where there's a lot of people who would want to use groundwater. So we're taking those high water use areas and putting that management on top of those areas. So the management plans are sort of the rules. They are the guidelines that are enacted by the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. And the act was never meant to be static. It was meant to be fluid. See, I can do it.
There you go again.
It was meant to be something that changed as conditions changed. And so it, within the actual statute, which does remain the same, it provided for these management plans that were to go through the life of the act. And we had the first and second and the third, right? The fourth management plan was supposed to be written so that it would go into place in 2010 and stay in place until 2020. The fifth management plan was supposed to be written, go into place in 2020, and then last until 2025, which is the last year that the 1980 Act contemplates.
Wait. But didn't you say we started drafting the fourth plan last year, which would have been 2020 when it was supposed to be over?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Help me.
So yeah, that's actually what a few people said. So here's what happened. In 2008 and 2009, that's when the Department of Water Resources really should have been writing and promulgating and doing all the stuff that was necessary to get the fourth management plan in place. What was happening in our state and kind of nationwide, Katie, in 2008 and 2009?
Well, that was a very long time ago.
But
if I remember at that time, the economy wasn't so great.
Yeah, that's sort of the overarching thing we remember, right? So it was a very down economy. And in that down economy, state agencies, including our Department of Water Resources, had to lay off a lot of people. And that included the people who would have been drafting these plans. So fell by the wayside, but everyone was so distracted by 1,000 other crises at the time, right? That they just never got drafted, and kind of nobody noticed and kind of nobody said anything. And we just sort of
till last year.
Kind of, yeah. So it was a couple years before, but every 8 years or so, every agency in Arizona goes through something called a sunset audit. They call it a sunset because technically after 8 years, agencies are set to sunset or go away unless the legislature reauthorizes them. They almost always reauthorize them because we're not going to let our Department of Water Resources sunset, right. But that's an excuse for the state to audit that department and say, what are you doing really well? What's fallen by the wayside? And so clearly this had fallen by the wayside. So one of the biggest criticisms from the auditors was that the department was so behind on the fourth management plan and the fifth management plan.
So did that leave them very much time to put these together?
Yeah, it really didn't.
Like overnight.
Yeah, right. And that's kind of part of the reason that we had to be so involved. We were always going to be involved, but our involvement looked very different because of that time pressure. Because they were under just the gun and really needed to get these things done, the department basically drafted the entire fourth management plan very quickly and independently. So without a lot of input from stakeholders, without any input from stakeholders, frankly.
That's never good.
No, it really isn't. And so after they drafted it, they, made it public, and they did actively solicit feedback from stakeholders. So they had a series of listening sessions, a series of working groups. But the problem is, it really was not a great format to do that. For one, everything was virtual because we were in the thick of pandemic. And they were so panicked about getting this out so quickly that, when we had concerns and we really needed to dive deeper into certain aspects of these plans, kind of the response was like, well, we got to get it out. So no, we'll just talk about that in the fifth plan, right? We'll talk about it there. But it's not okay to say we'll just talk about it in the fifth plan, because these plans are building blocks. So the fourth plan is the foundation on which the fifth plan rests. So if there are some fundamental flaws in number 4, they're just going to carry right over into number 5.
And the fifth is going to crumble.
Exactly. So we really ran into some roadblocks, right, when we were talking about this fourth management plan. And as you can imagine, that didn't really make our producers, especially in Pinal County, which is really the ag spot that relies most on groundwater, didn't really make them feel confident that we were going forward in a way that recognized the efforts they'd made to conserve water, or that would allow them to preserve that water use going forward.
So what do we do?
Our whole goal was to really slow down the freight train that we felt like was coming for us. And so what we did was put together a very targeted stakeholder group of water users in especially the Pinal AMA, but also in the Phoenix AMA, where we've got some of our Maricopa County guys. And we called ourselves the Ag Collaborators, because that's really what we were. We wanted to collaborate with the department to say, this is not working as a process. This plan is not working as a plan, and we need to tell you why. We need to have these discussions in a very open and in a very understanding kind of way, right? Where it wasn't a fault-finding mission. It was a, this is what doesn't work. How can we fix it? So really looking for those kinds of solutions. And our biggest issues with the plans were with the Best Management Practices Program, or the BMP program. Long story short, the Groundwater Act allows you to enter into either 2 ways to restrict your groundwater use. The first is that they just give you a number and they say, this is how many acre feet you can use. Can't use any more than that. Go forth and prosper. Or
it's not based on like anything in your production or past use, or
based on historic use.
Okay.
So, and by historic, I mean like your use in 1975, historic. And so obviously it's going to look a lot different today, which is why the BMP program is really crucial, because that program, instead of giving you a number and saying you just can't use more than this, says use as much as you need, but here are the things you have to do to make sure you're using that water well. And so there's a 4-page worksheet of different water conservation practices, like making sure your ditches are lined, or timing your irrigation structures, or using drip or sprinkler, or using different soil additives or no-till, like all of these things that are really, really good for water use. You have to use enough of them. They're all assigned a point value. You have to use enough
the point system. I love the point system.
Right? I love a rubric, man. It's my favorite.
Tell me what I'm aiming for.
Yeah. So that's what the BMP program does. And the fourth plan was really making a lot of changes to how those points were calculated and what practices were receiving which points values, that we didn't think were consistent with how agriculture actually works, especially not here in 2020. And so, made some changes to that. And we're really, really looking to the department and looking to be the experts on what does agriculture on the ground really look like? Because as much as we love our department staff, and as great as they are at their job of, developing these worksheets and at looking at complicated hydrology statistics and knowing what they mean, not a lot of them have ever actually been on a farm. And so that made it really complicated for us to say, here's why this doesn't work, because they just had no frame of reference for why that might not work. And so we actually brought them out to some farms. We did a whole day of tours, especially in the Pinal County AMA, and we said, here's what this looks like. And when you say you need us to do X, Y, and Z, here's what that would take while we're out here. Get your boots dirty and explain and understand sort of what all of this looks like. And that's kind of the biggest thing I think that the collaborators were able to do, is give that staff a frame of reference for something that otherwise they just would never have seen before.
What a great form of advocacy, really bringing them to the farms to understand the impact that they're having. Because I think that's the complaint that a lot of folks have when we're talking about things in the legislature and politics, so to speak, right? Is they're writing the rules, but they don't know. And sometimes that's not their fault. And so
Yeah.
it takes the efforts of people and organizations like Farm Bureau and our other ag communities and our producers to invite these people out to their farms and ranches and let them see it so that
Right.
they can take that into consideration, because you don't know what you don't know, so we can't always be mad, right?
Right. And I think really the proof is in what happens when that kind of advocacy and interaction goes on. Because thanks to that, and thanks to us sitting down and saying, it's not that it's a fault issue, it's that you just simply don't know what's going on. We were able to make very meaningful changes to the fourth plan and then ultimately the foundation for the fifth plan. And now that they're actually writing the fifth plan, we've been actively engaged from day one. And so we've been able to, for that BMP program, for example, now it's stakeholders, it's actual farmers on the ground who are taking that BMP program, looking at that point system and that worksheet and saying, here's what makes sense. And we get to have those hard discussions among us as farmers first, and then figure it out and agree on it, and then take our agreed upon package to the department and say, this is what's going to work and here's why. And it's just been probably, I think, one of the most rewarding things I've been able to do is see a department come on board and understand and appreciate stakeholder input, but then also see stakeholders become so invested and so involved in the process so that they're really saying, yeah, we want to shape this policy for the better.
That's how it should be.
I agree.
Okay, so Chelsea, help us understand a little bit now, when are these plans going to become effective, right? Because if we remember from I don't know, 5 minutes ago, that fourth one was supposed to be done 2020 and on to the fifth. And here we sit April 19th, 2021. So where are we at? When are these plans doing their thing?
All right, so they just kind of compressed the timeline. The fourth management plan is going to be effective in 2022. And if all goes according to plan and the drafting and the administrative and the goes effective on the fifth plan, that will become effective January 1st, 2025. So it will remain in effect throughout that year of 2025.
Wow. What happens after 2025?
It's a mystery. We don't know, because the 1980 Groundwater Management Act only went from that 1980 period to the 2025 period. That's sort of the time period that the drafters of the act thought, okay, by then we'll know how to get safe yields. We'll know, which means that we're not using more groundwater than is being replenished. That's actually kind of a messy definition, but think of it that way, right? We'll be in safe yield. We'll kind of have this all figured out, and we'll be a well-oiled machine by then. That's really not. No, we're not. We're not. And a lot of things have changed since 1980, right? A lot of things have changed. So it's understandable that we're not. If I had, with my crystal ball, what I can see, I don't think the 1980 Groundwater Management Act is going away. And I also don't think it's going to be replaced wholesale by something else. I think what will end up happening is that the legislature will take that plan, they'll take those laws, and they'll say, okay, here's what doesn't work anymore. Here's what's still working. Here's what we need to add. And they'll just kind of amend that plan to make it look like what the legislature at the time wants it to look like. But we really don't know what that's going to mean. And so one of the things that we're working on very actively is watching those discussions, because they are already starting in terms of what is the plan for Arizona after 2025. So we're watching those discussions, we're actively engaged in those discussions, and really trying to do the exact same thing there that we've done with the department, which is tell agriculture's story, make sure that agriculture's perspective is paramount in what they're talking about, and make sure that the folks who are making decisions on behalf of agriculture actually know what agriculture looks like. So that's kind of our plan going forward.
I like that plan. I like that plan. Hey, let's talk a little bit about Colorado River.
All right, and I'll be quick on this one, and there's a couple reasons for that. The first is that it's complicated and there's not a whole lot of time. There's also not a whole lot of good news. So I don't love ending our last webinar of 2021's school year on this kind of very downer situation, but we need to talk about it nevertheless. But I will also just kind of preface everything I'm saying by telling you that there's a 7-minute or so NPR interview that President Smallhouse did last week. I've linked to it in the last slide. Highly, highly encourage you all to listen to that because it does a great job outlining this issue and what's happening with Pinal County agriculture. And so would way rather have you listen to President Smallhouse than to me. But
I'll make sure we have that link separately on the website
awesome.
With this as well.
Yep, that sounds great. So the reason it's not a lot of good news to report is that we do expect that as early as the 1st of January, we will have a declaration that there is a shortage of water on the Colorado River.
Well, that doesn't sound good. I mean, we use a lot of the Colorado water here in Arizona, don't we?
No, we use a lot. The last time I checked, it was about 37% of our state's water use comes from that river. So shortage on it is a really big deal. Thankfully, our state and other states who use this river could see this coming. And so they didn't just sit on their hands, they were prepared for this. So we prepared as Arizona by enacting something called the Drought Contingency Plan. If you were all around in 2019, you heard a lot about DCP when we talked about all of that. And this plan was, in its purest form, an agreement between water users to make sure that users who had the highest priority for water, so like municipal uses, houses, businesses, and tribal uses in Arizona, to make sure that they continued to have access to water even as we had shortages of the water that was available.
So where did agriculture fit on this priority totem pole of sorts?
Yeah, not great. Not in a great spot. We're at the bottom of the totem pole or the top of the bucket, however you want to look at it. We're the last ones to get that water. And so that means that pretty much all of the cuts of water that are happening because of the shortage are going to be taken away from Pinal County agriculture. So, we just talked about the groundwater issues with Pinal County. Now this is surface water issues with Pinal County. They cannot catch a break there, which is really unfortunate since it's a $2.3 billion agricultural industry. So you'd think that we would want to protect that, and we do. And because we want to protect that industry, farmers were given a voice in the discussions that led to this drought contingency plan, right? But at the end of the day, it was really, really difficult to combat the existing priority system. That was something that had been in place for decades. There was a lot of political and sort of even legal maneuvering that got that priority system to where it was. And so it was just a huge uphill battle to try and change that in the face of shortages. And so Central Arizona farmers who use Colorado River water, which is delivered to them through the CAP, had made some deals in the early 2000s, which is kind of why they were in the situation that they were in, because it made water more affordable at that time when they really needed it. Now, having said all that, even with all of those kind of political and legal decisions and deals that were made, those were all made on sort of this foundation that those farmers would have access to water until 2030, that was basically a guarantee, and that's kind of where their security lied. But now we're looking at 2022, and we're looking at basically the possibility that they would lose all of their access to surface water at that point.
That is 8 years earlier, and that's like 1 year from now.
Yeah.
So what's going to be the result of that?
So really the result of that is going to be that we've got this industry that we already talked about how important that is, and we're taking away pretty much half of the water that it has access to, because about half of their water use comes from groundwater and about half of their water use comes from surface water.
Wait a second. So you say that half the water is from the Colorado River,
yeah,
right? So I'm assuming the other half is groundwater.
That's right.
I mean, that makes sense. So can't they just use that?
Well, they can. They have full legal rights to use all of the groundwater that they're entitled to use under that Groundwater Management Act, right? So going back to all that fifth management plan stuff, totally have access to that groundwater. But at the end of the day, groundwater use alone can't make up for all of the surface water use. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is how our ditch and canal systems are designed. You need a certain volume of water to get the water where it needs to go when it needs to get there. You also need a certain volume of water to push that water out to the end of your fields, the way your fields are designed and the way that your fields are leveled. So you have to have that much water pressure coming through your ditches and your conveyance systems to make that possible. So even if, there was the possibility of pumping as much groundwater as they're using surface water, the engineering is just totally different, right? But the other thing is that we don't have the capacity to just turn on every well and have every drop of water that we need in the middle of July when our temperatures are as high as they're going to get and our water use consumption is as high as it's going to get. So we just don't have the infrastructure and we don't have the hydrology to make groundwater the only thing that we rely on in Pinal County.
So is there anything good to report here?
I hope so. One of the things that the irrigation districts in Pinal County need most right now is money, right? Common theme of life. They need money to improve that well infrastructure. Okay, that again, that's not going to be the silver bullet, right? Because we still need those conveyance systems to work. But if we can get the money to increase and improve our well infrastructure, we can at least allow our farmers to access the volume of water that they need at those sort of peak use times, right? When it's hot and when plants need a lot of water. Right now, we've got sort of a full court press on the efforts to get that water to our farmers. We have state lawmakers that we're asking to make that money available at really favorable terms. We have federal lawmakers that we're asking to include funding for that in infrastructure packages or any other sort of water conservation packages that we're looking at. And then we have federal agencies that we're saying, hey, can you recognize the value of what our farmers are doing to keep water in the Colorado River and then fit that into some of your programs of work as well? And then we've already gotten approval for a grant program for some of this well infrastructure. It's the federal government, so there are more hoops to jump through than I think I ever imagined there could be on a grant project like this. But basically, we have the engines firing on all cylinders, looking at every aspect of ways to find solutions to this problem, and really hoping that somewhere, somehow, money will free up to make these wells and this well infrastructure possible.
Never a dull moment. We appreciate you guys and everyone else who seems to be treading water and trying to swim upstream on a regular basis when it comes to this topic.
I would appreciate a dull moment.
Right?
Especially for our guys in Pinal County. My heart just 100% goes out to them. And I'm thankful to be able to work for an organization that really does get to dedicate our resources to trying to find some solutions there. So we'll keep you all abreast of what's happening and how you can help. There we go. There you go. Because it's an uphill battle for sure, and it's not over. So we hope to have lots more positive to report to you back when we start these back up in August.
So what you're saying is water might come back at us again.
Oh, definitely. There's no way that it won't. We'll put it that way.
Not a bad thing. Not a bad thing.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have some great resources available for this as well. That last bullet point is the interview that I mentioned, and we will link that separately when we post this presentation. But also, if you want to keep track of legislation like House Bill 2691, this is the link to look at any bills that are going through the legislature. I will admit it's a really complicated process to use if you don't already know the bill number. So that's why I give you the bill number here so you can track that particular bill. But if you've got other questions about stuff we're doing, just reach out to me. I would love to tell you what those numbers are and kind of give you background information on any bills you're interested in.
And they can reach out to you at Chelsea McGuire at azfb.org.
That's right, Katie. That's where y'all can find me. Super easy, first and last name. Same with the 4th and 5th management plans discussions. All of the meetings that the ADWR has about those are public meetings, and so they're recorded. All the materials are available. So if you really want to stay interested and stay on top of what's happening there, you can use the new.azwater.gov website to do that as well.
Oh, and then I saw that link there for the President Smallhouse NPR interview. So that's the one I'll make sure that we separate out. So it's a super easy link for him to get to.
Yep.
I always enjoy hearing her speak, no matter what the issue is.
It's true. She is so eloquent and so passionate about these issues that it gets me fired up every time too.
Yeah. Well, hey, Chelsea, I can't believe it, but we are at the end of our final webinar for this 2020-2021 school year.
Where did the time go?
I just want to throw a huge thank you to you for always being so willing to share what it is that you and your team are doing here at Farm Bureau. I think this information is very valuable to not only our students, but I've been getting a lot of responses from our teachers who enjoy these. And I know it takes some time out of your day to put these things together, and definitely always appreciate you going with my humor. And my lack of knowledge, but that's why it helps everybody who's watching, right? I'm just one of them. So
well, it is absolutely my pleasure to do it. You know, this is exactly how I want to spend my time, is helping you all navigate these issues and become fluent in these issues, because you're the ones that get to go out there and educate your friends and your peers, and then eventually vote for these people and vote for these policies. So that's what I'm here for, and always happy to do it. And Katie, I'm sure we will be reaching out to you students and teachers about what you do want to see next year in terms of these webinars. We've got some ideas up our sleeves too, but we want to make sure we're responsive to our audience. But just, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm glad we made this happen.
Yes, appreciate it. All right, everyone, we're signing off. We'll see you next year.
See you later.
Bye.